Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits. I believe myself to be completely unique, and anecdotally I can prove it from the evidence that there's someone else in the room who isn't me.
I'm not Thos Ribbits, that's right. My name is Tim Saywood. That's really all I have to say on the matter, and I'm afraid I won't be drawn any further.
It's a closed book.
It is.
We're here to talk about a musical which has now closed in London and is probably unlikely to return, I think, and that's From Here to Eternity.
Which is where it's about to go.
Well, it's gone, yes. Which has been described in all the newspaper and advertising as Tim Rice's epic musical.
That's right.
Well, let's talk about... You and I went to see it.
Yes.
And we'll be talking about what we saw, but can I ask, what did you sense before you went in? What did you pick up about the musical? How did it feel like it was going to be, as opposed to what it actually turned out to be?
I don't know that it was profoundly different to what I expected. I mean, I was expecting something in the Miss Saigon sort of a mould, I think, and I think that's kind of very much what they were trying to do with it.
I got Rodgers and Hammerstein notes
from
My Wine.
I agree, yes. So somewhere between South Pacific and Miss Saigon, basically, somewhere which would be somewhere in the Pacific, I suppose.
A theatre of war featuring American acts,
exactly.
American soldiers.
Yes, that's right. And so something a little bit epic, and but also with a strongly personal story. And of course, those I don't know much about. I didn't know much about the film, and I still don't. But of course, there's that iconic beach scene, which of course was used, I think, somewhere in the publicity for this as well, and of course is the central image for the film. And that's about it, really. That's all I was expecting. And of course, Tim Rice was attached to it. I hadn't heard of Stuart Brayson or Bill Oakes.
Well, it's Stuart Brayson's West End debut.
Right.
He's worked in other parts of the country.
And Bill Oakes being the book adapter in this case. And so really, when we say it's Tim Rice's musical, I mean, they're his lyrics, but it's not his musical, I think it's fair to say.
No, although his name is the one that's being used to advertise
he's the one that most people have heard of, yeah.
You're quite right, because From Here to Eternity is most known as the film with Burt Lancaster and Deborah Kerr.
Yeah.
And as you say, that scene on the beach, which has been spoofed and parodied 1,000 times. I've seen many different versions of it. And interestingly, but they don't use exactly the same structure in this. The scene is actually standing up.
Yes.
Rather than lying down.
They do have a bit of lying down, but after they've done all the dialogue.
That's what the interval. Yeah. We all had to lie down in the interval here. But it's trading very strongly on the film.
Yes.
Neither you or I had ever seen a film, or indeed read the book, which came out 2 years before the film. So the book's 51 and the
film 53, yeah.
That's right. So we had to take the thing as it came, with only what the advertising beforehand had led us to believe it might be. As I say, I was getting very strong Rodgers and Hammerstein sense, and a lot of the adverts in London featured one of the main men in the piece, one of the male characters, topless.
Yes.
So it was obviously looking for the attractive male market, which brings in a certain number of women and a certain number of men.
That's right.
Let's start with the big question then. Was it successful?
No.
No, I agree. So let's spend the next hour explaining why.
So that's killed all the suspense in this episode.
It wasn't really.
But it'll be interesting to say in what ways it didn't really live up to it. I think that they were going more for Miss Saigon than having seen it, than South Pacific in the end.
Oh yes, I agree.
Yes. And there were some very big dramatic choral numbers. There was a whole series of scenes, as indeed there are in the book, set in a brothel. And it sort of traded very much on the same sort of type of stuff there. But I think where it failed to convince, well, the two key areas actually, because often when something doesn't work, usually people blame the book. Quite frequently you get these most amazing tunes attached to something that's completely incoherent and therefore doesn't really get anybody excited. In this case, I don't think I would blame the book. I think I would blame the music, which is unusual, because normally you don't get music of this frankly low quality in a West End product before it gets to the stage, but I didn't think it was great.
We both identified the score as being the weakest element of it.
Yes.
Quite quickly, and certainly by the end of the performance.
Yes.
It was actually the range, I thought.
It was the range. I mean, for me, the songs generally had one major theme in them, did not transpose very much in during the course of the song. I mean, maybe like a truck driver's gear shift or two, but the actual lines of the songs didn't go to interesting harmonic places compared to some other things that we would have seen. So I think that actually for me was the biggest disappointment, really.
Can I just
lots of performers, and I thought the arrangements weren't bad at all, but it was the actual basic musical material that was the weakness.
Well, I'd agree with you absolutely there. Now, it's interesting because I've actually read some of the newspaper reviews online about the show, and a lot of them picked up what they're talking about, the variety of styles and songs. And I was trying and reconcile this in my head. How can you have a variety of songs which don't appear to have a great deal of variety in them? Because that's the view that we both came to. And I think it's true that there is a variety of attempted styles. So,
yes.
For example, the Pruitt character, and we'll talk a little bit more about the plot later, but he's the young man who's come to the army and is really he's an individual in an environment that doesn't allow for individualism. Yep. That's his story, essentially, with a bit of love thrown in. But he's a songwriter as well, so he sings these occasional songs himself to his own guitar. There's the standard stuff that you'd get, the diegetic and non-diegetic songs throughout the piece. There's a 1940s crooning kind of number.
There is.
There's a couple of rock and roll numbers of preempting, or sort of Lindy hopping at least, preempting the 50s slightly. So there's a comic blues number, I think you'd have to call it, or as near as damn
which was a very successful one, I thought.
I think the most successful piece.
As a song, anyway.
Yeah. And there was some thematic stuff. So I agree at one level, you could look at it and say, look, the composer Stuart Brayson has written lots of different kinds of songs and different. There's even a sort of military songs, as you'd expect, as it's mostly about a corps of American soldiers.
Certainly.
But the variants within each of the songs made them feel very much of a kind.
Yeah.
So I accept there's lots of stylistic attempts at different songs, but it feels within a really, really narrow range of what was achieved, and therefore they all feel very similar. It's certainly from the same pen, but it's not a same. But the ability to take those songs and make them fly in an expanded score didn't come across. So it's lots of songs in a very narrow score.
And I think there is a book criticism here, which is to do with the integration of the score and the character development and so on, because I think there isn't, the character development isn't that great actually in the show. The most interesting dialogue, and there was very good dialogue, I don't know if it was from the film or not because I don't know that well, but was between the sort of older couple, Milt Warden and Karen Holmes, which was there was just a certain sharpness to it, which sort of was in that, I don't know, Cary Grant sort of ballpark, if you like, in terms of the sharpness of the retorts, particularly that she was giving.
Yes.
In the early stages. But unfortunately, they then became more genericized as a couple later on, and because they were quite sharp with each other at the beginning, it was a little hard to get where the love came from in the relationship, and that perhaps wasn't explicated that well.
Well, if we're talking about some of the structural issues, then yes, let's address that, because there are the story of the piece is there's a context of an American platoon, G Troop or whatever they're called, and the war hasn't started for America, so they're based in Hawaii in 1941 in the build-up to Pearl Harbor. Of course, there is no build-up because no one knows it's coming.
It came out of the blue, yes,
absolutely.
As far as they were concerned,
and they are a pretty disparate bunch of, and it's a rubbishy set of soldiers, if I may say. By the end of it, we've had suicide, we've had murder, several murders, in fact, bullying, and then when the war finally does arrive, they're all very rubbish and get killed immediately.
Yes, they're taken very much by surprise, and I think the sort of moral outrage that might come from like them, being, as it were, lambs to the slaughter, which they kind of were in that circumstance.
It's undercut.
It's a little bit undercut by that. I think there is a sort of perhaps a sense in which they are supposed to be a little bit slack because, of course, they weren't expecting, to have what happened to happen. But they
really are allowing their internecine warfare, and that's all it is.
Yes.
It's about bullying and who hates who and who's got what secrets and how can they shut each other up and individual power play, and it's just vile. Yeah, they were a horrible bunch of people.
Yes, largely. Pruitt, who is this central character, of course, has to. He has a thing. He has a set of principles. We know he's got principles because he won't box. That's basically how we're introduced to him.
Or play the bugle.
No, that's right. And if that's not a good principle, I don't know what is, quite frankly. And he
really sucks at blowing.
And that's the main characteristic we're given, but we are given it rather a lot of times. And in fact, it's not ever really put to the test in quite that, in a very dramatically clear way. I think it's probably fair to say. And so that, again, a lot of his choices in the thing don't seem to sort of add up to a deepening of his character.
He's got two strands, hasn't he? He's what he won't do, and we're told immediately he won't make friends, he won't have a relationship, he won't bugle and he won't box.
Yes.
And then much of the story is about them trying to make him do bugling and boxing, particularly his soldier colleagues.
Yes.
For reasons which aren't very clear. There's a sort of a tyrannical captain or colonel or whatever, senior officer who wants him to box, and because he doesn't want to, they bully him solidly.
Well, the colonel should be at the centre of the whole thing, because, of course, he's the source of tension for both of the two major characters, male protagonists. But he doesn't really come into focus, as I think, as a character. No. So maybe that's where the structural issue is.
He comes in, he comes out, but he doesn't. He's not a big presence.
He acts in a generic sort of big bad sort of a way. But we don't get to see a lot of his inner life or his point of view, I think, and perhaps that's one of the weaknesses because I think to get really good tragedy, and this is a tragedy, you have to feel the tension between the differing interests that are going to occur.
What's going to drive people to do these difficult things?
And I think everybody gets a bit cardboardy and sticks to the one motivation, and it gets a bit dull.
But taking us back to Pruitt, so we've got this list of things he won't do, and various attempts, mostly by his army colleagues, to make him do it. The one area where he's not under pressure, which is, i.e. not to have a relationship, the thing he says he's not going to do, and we're never actually given a reason for that, is the one area where he lets himself down, because he gets taken by his one and only friend in the army to a brothel, where he immediately falls for one of the prostitutes. Yeah. And so the rest of his story is about, will he be able to form a working relationship with this woman who's desperate to become respectable and leave Hawaii. Yeah. Bearing in mind he's decided he's going to become a career soldier for 30 years, a 30-year man, one of the songs. That's his kind of tension and character. What's interesting in his character, and I must say here are spoilers, is that ultimately the pressure that comes to him is avenging the death of his one army friend, or living and he's given a perfect opportunity basically to desert and flee with her when the war starts in Hawaii. At Pearl Harbor, and he doesn't do it. Yeah. So he decides not to go for the possible, and decides to avenge one of the things he said he was never going to do, which was have friends, to his own detriment, because he doesn't realise it yet, but he gets shot for his troubles.
He does, yes, exactly.
So that's his plot.
Sorry to give that away in case you were seeing it.
Well, we say there are spoilers, So that's his plot. I wasn't very interested in that character, I must say. No. And then you've got the other plot, as you said, which is the older lovers. So if he's one of the younger lovers, or the younger lover, there's the older lover, as you say, who is the second in command to the bad captain, or whatever rank he holds, who falls for the captain's wife. Yes. And as you say, we get this is how we got into this conversation, this structural problem, whereby he meets her once when he finds her looking in a broom cupboard. Yes. And he says, more or less, what are you doing here? I think you're out of bounds. And she gives him the sharp edge of his tongue. The sharp edge of her tongue by being incredibly rude to him. Yeah. And then the next time, he pops round to her house, and the very first thing he says to her is, I want to go to bed with you. Exactly. And it was quite hard, as you say, to make that leap between a sassy chatback. Because it wasn't thrilling. I thought it was rude wisecracks rather than.
I could have brought that up to that point, but they didn't really flesh that relationship out in a way that I then bought. You see, I think that you could start with sex and go on to friendship, couldn't you? Or
it's been done.
Or love, but I didn't quite. That was the missing middle part for me.
But also, there's great inconsistency there as well, because her response to meeting this man who she's been quite rude to in a broom cupboard, or near a broom cupboard, when he pops round to her house to say, I want to sleep with you, is that she whips off all her clothing.
She does.
She stands on a table and goes down to her underpants, basically.
Yeah.
And then later on, they start making a go of their relationship, and I think you're supposed to feel some sympathy for her because it's clear that she's had to have a hysterectomy because of her husband, and she's trapped. Yes, absolutely. But it does turn out that she's been putting it about a bit. And he gets surprised at that, having asked her once if she'll sleep with him, and she drops her clothing. I don't know. But it doesn't seem that consistent. No. He didn't have to woo her very hard.
It didn't quite stack up, that relationship. Yeah. I mean, the rest of the story is a sort of the individual versus the army or the collective and that sort of thing, and that is a very sort of obvious story. But again, it doesn't get quite told in the way that, I don't know, would give it its nice tragic conclusion. One interesting area is that, and we haven't talked about it yet, is that it goes off. There's a subplot, and one of the choices that our hero faces is that he's not tempted exactly, but he's taken by an army colleague, his friend
Maggio,
to go to a gay bar, and where the soldiers pick up extra money by basically doing sexual favours for older gay men who congregate in Hawaii for reasons. I'm sure this did happen. It is in the book. And that was sort of quite interesting because it had to tread quite an interesting line at that point.
I'm glad you said that, yes.
Because I think the character is morally opposed and repulsed by what's happening.
Well, a soldier from the 1940s is unlikely to be very tolerant.
Indeed.
I think.
Well, except that one of the other soldiers is quite tolerant.
Yeah.
It turns out, and he there's a little wobble. He can potentially land this other soldier and indeed some of the older gay men into trouble, and then he finally resiles from doing that. He doesn't he doesn't go there, and I don't know what happens in the book if you're aware of that, but
well, it is in the book.
The episode.
The gay subplot is in the book and not in the film, we should say.
That's right.
Well, I tell you what, I was interesting. The fine line for me was how do you play 1940s opposition to homosexuality with a much more liberal London 2014 audience?
I thought they go ahead. Sorry.
Well, the point I've got, so he's got his liberal friend Maggio, who I think is...
It's all about the money.
Well, yes, although you get the impression that he's a bit more interested than perhaps he's letting on. The way I read it, the Maggio character is probably bisexual, because he's certainly interested in women, but he doesn't seem to be opposed to the men. It's not just a money-making exercise, because he keeps going back to do it.
Yes.
Maggio is, I think, the best character in this piece anyway, certainly, and we'll talk about him in a minute. So he takes his friend Pruitt to the gay club to make some money, as you say, from essentially giving gay men blowjobs, I think is pretty much the concept that's being offered.
Yep.
Let's be brutal. And Pruitt goes to the gay club. He's a bit wary, but he goes to the gay club. But once he's there and he realises that it's full of gay men, shock apparently, he then reacts very badly to it because he sees them as filthy queers, to use the terminology of the time. So as an audience member, it was quite difficult to feel sympathy for this character who I think you're supposed to feel sympathy for, the Pruitt character, because he's the one fighting the system. But he's not in himself tolerant in the 21st century attitudes. But as you say, then later on when it's all going horribly wrong and a gay man has been called in to give evidence with threats against him if he doesn't, for example, right. Pruitt doesn't, I use the word advisory, he doesn't finger him to get him into trouble. So, but that felt to me that character was being pulled out of where he actually was as a written character, I'm guessing, from the period in which it was written, early 50s, to meet at least halfway a modern 21st century audience sensibility. And I'm not sure it actually worked.
Yeah, they have to tread a very difficult line and give us a character who basically decides to let them go. It's slightly different to what I've just recently read in the book, or from the Unexpurgated book, the original book as it was intended to be published, in which there's a scene between him and a gay soldier, which there is indeed in the musical as well, where he's very ambivalent about it. Actually, he's disgusted in the book by the soldier who actually is gay and who sort of does a lot of this type of activity, has a strong sense, the soldier, of self-contempt, and he backs it up. But he also says that he doesn't judge him, but he also says that with enormous contempt. So it's kind of interesting that the attitudes, clearly, it was going to be difficult to illustrate that.
Well, as you've just pointed out, the history is that the book in 1951 features gay themes, but was edited even then to take out certain stronger sections about homosexuality.
There's a very explicit scene, which they've just restored in the latest edition.
And then in 2011 it was reintroduced to the book, I believe, for the electronic version.
Yes.
And we've just double-checked that online.
Yeah.
But the way you've described it to me is all very traditional cliches, self-loathing gay man stuff.
Yeah. And we are in the era of victim and all those sorts of things,
yes.
and that was the narrative then, really. Gays were self-loathing people who
to be pitied
thought
if you had any views at all,
who thought their mothers were saints.
Yes. However, we have this, at least in the stage version, we have this odd, I think, ambivalent character who by leaps and bounds is the most interesting character in the narrative.
Maggio, yeah.
And that's Maggio, yeah, absolutely. He's an Italian extraction soldier.
Yep. From the northeast.
He's the first one to make friends with Pruitt. In fact, he's the only one to make friends with Pruitt.
Yep.
He's seen as a little bit of a sort of a ducker and diver and a wheeler and dealer. He does gambling. He's a chancellor, yes, that's right. But he's generous as well, because he takes Pruitt to the brothel and pays when Pruitt hasn't got any money. He looks after Pruitt. And Pruitt sort of rejects him when he realises that he goes with gay men.
Yep.
And then Maggio's story takes on a life of its own, because Maggio unfortunately is caught at the gay bar and sent to a military prison, essentially, where he does hard labour. and his sort of sense of individuality, interestingly enough, more so than
brutally
Pruitt,
put down. Yeah,
is brutally put down. He tries to assert it, but he gets put down, and he is in fact murdered by the military policeman in charge of the process.
Yeah,
and that is the trigger for Pruitt to then make a decision between going out with Leanne, his prostitute girlfriend, and having a final life of happiness back in America, or going to avenge the death of his friend who he has let down.
Yeah,
but he's an interesting trigger for dynamic in the second act in terms of the narrative, but he's also the most interesting character in his own right because he's got a personality. He's outside of too many of the cliches, and I thought quite appealingly put across. I should say that we went on a Monday night and we did not see the cast actors in the role of Pruitt or in the role of Maggio. Maggio's being played by Ryan Sampson and getting actually very good reviews. He's the one who's getting the best reviews in the newspapers for the piece. We saw his understudy. However, he still came across as the most interesting character. The one you had some kind of sympathy for, I think.
Yeah.
The one who's actually probably the biggest victim in the piece. He seems to have more of the virtues of being a human than any of the others, in the sense that he's generous and he's friendly. Yeah. And he's enough of an individual. He knows how to play the system. He doesn't want to draw too much attention to himself. I don't know. He feels like the everyman figure, except of course he isn't an everyman.
No.
Whereas actually Pruitt, who I think is perceived, he's from Kentucky, I think it is, and at one level is like a proto Elvis Presley at some
yes, I suppose he sort of is.
Yeah. Reluctantly going into the army, perhaps, although intending to make a career of it as a kind of punishment for things that have occurred elsewhere. Is much less a real character. In fact, he's just such a self-denying.
Yeah.
Well, he's referred to as a screwball all the way through, as a prize. Pardon my language. A prize fuck-up is how he's described by one of his superiors.
To say his moral choices aren't made as clear as they possibly could be. We do get some much more interesting things for Maggio. So.
Oh yeah. So that's the book.
Yes.
We're not vastly impressed by it. Oh, I suppose I should then say, it concludes in the way you would expect it to conclude, with the attack on Pearl Harbor occurring.
Of course, yes.
And we see slaughter on a grand scale, because you mentioned the size of the cast. There's 33 members of the cast, which is a big company for the West End, a very expensive show to run in that sense. And by far, most of them are male soldiers who are immediately put to the sword, as far as I can see, or they die in the attack for the most part. And you are supposed, I suspect, to feel a great sympathy and, what a tragic loss of life for these young people. But
that doesn't really come into focus.
No, not at all.
It's forced into focus in a final number, The Boys of 41, and indeed it's sort of foreshadowed at the very beginning. So effectively we're set out a stall that says we're going to see the story of some, wasted lives, and that's hammered home at the end. But we don't... The story doesn't add up to that.
No.
That we actually get. The story is much more about the individuals, and yeah.
Yeah. Also, there's very few people you care about.
Yeah.
Not that should be the only thing, but if the death of many people becomes an intellectual exercise rather than an emotional exercise, then what is the point of having made it into a musical?
I think Les Mis is kind of the comparator here, really, because that great stirring, do you hear the people sing at the end and so on, does seem to do something, I think, for that show. And we've seen a whole load of characters and a lot of youth and enthusiastic youth sort of, die on barricades basically by that stage. And we've got to know a specific strand of that and a family, and who we've had significant.
But you extrapolate the larger from the minor.
Yes, that's right.
Which
exactly.
you don't do in this.
No, exactly. Yeah. Because although we might have individual pangs of sympathy for any of the individual characters, it doesn't. It's very belaboured, and I think it doesn't quite come off.
The one I like best is already dead by the time of the attack.
Yes,
by the hands of actually a military man. So
Exactly.
I don't feel a great deal of sympathy for these military men then getting.
And who's the outrage directed at as well? Because throughout the plot, the outrage should be directed at the sort of the military leadership and its sort of avatar in the show. But of course, really, the deaths are caused by the Japanese. I mean, except for the one,
except for the murders,
except for the military, the sort of judicial murder. So it's confused, and it doesn't quite sort of add up to one single message, which it should.
We should say, by the way, that there are 2 murders and a suicide before we get to Pearl Harbor.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
Can I talk about gender?
Go on, then.
Obviously, any musical that's heavily featuring the army is likely to be male or more male than female.
Yes.
And that's certainly true here. Now, it's got a large female cast because you have to have prostitutes running around. There's various prostitute scenes.
Indeed.
But in terms of female characters, there are only really 2. and I don't think they're very, very well drawn. You've got Karen Holmes, who's the wife of the bad commander of the troop, who's having the affair with Walden,
Yep.
And in fact is the principal woman, played by Rebecca Thornhill, who many people will remember as Crystal in Doctor Who: The Ultimate Adventure from
Sure.
from the late 1980s.
Many people will remember,
That's how
yeah.
I remembered her immediately. Although she's changed her hair colour since then, I should
Yes.
observe. But that character is the principal female character, and while Rebecca Thornhill is clearly doing what she can with it, there isn't much, I don't think, on the paper. She's given these sort of wisecracks and a need for some
Yes.
kind of love in her life, and that's fine. It's not very well drawn, but I think she draws something.
I think
she
gets
makes something
out
of
it,
that.
And then Lorraine.
But the and then I was going to say there's a second character, but I should just say, by the way, you mentioned Cary Grant earlier and the screwball comedy wisecracks. I didn't get it lacks the fizz.
Yes.
They're wisecracks, but they're fairly
But they're
leaden wisecracks.
dark.
Yeah, exactly.
They're darker. They're more
Yeah.
bitter
Yeah.
type of dialogue.
And then you've got the other principal female character, who is the one that Pruitt is having the relationship, which is Loren, played by Siobhan Harrison.
Yes.
And that's fine. It's another fine character. Her best moment, funnily enough, is in the opening scene where the two women bump into each other on a boat leaving Hawaii.
That's right. Yeah.
One hopefully to a better life, and one not.
No.
And so that's actually quite moving. That sets up the female characters. But unfortunately, having revealed what their endings are,
Yeah.
their stories to get to those endings, once you've set them up, Pruitt falls in love with the prostitute, but can they make a go of it? Walden wants to have an affair and successfully has an affair with Holmes. Can they make a go of it? We know the outcome.
Yeah.
So there's not enough meat on the bone for those two female characters, and bearing in mind they're the only two female characters of any note, there is in fact a madam who runs the brothel and a couple of the other prostitutes who occasionally get lines, but they're so significantly not characters of any
interesting
note.
thing about the availability of Lorraine, you said, because she has. She's not saintly, because obviously she's working in a brothel, but she's highly unavailable to our sort of main character because the love is not on offer, supposedly. But there's really, the book doesn't really make sense of the battle to kind of win her from that position, I don't think. So they just go there straight away, and then at some point they're in love, and you're like, oh, right, okay.
Yeah, when did that happen?
Good, all right, well, that's sorted, and there's a
Lucky
song about
old
it.
you.
But the song doesn't carry that
No.
change. The song just happens because after it's already sort of happened off stage, as it were, which is interesting, really. Again, and the obvious comparison here is in Miss Saigon to the relationship between the main GI and the main central character, and she has a troubled history and an amazingly strong song about the death of her parents and so on. I mean, it really gives us a great deal of her very early on, and there's an attempt at that, but it doesn't quite come off in the same way in this.
And I think it's a pity because, as I say, with a plot that's so male-dominated, the two women should be allowed to shine.
Yeah.
Indeed, there should be more than two women, but there aren't, and that's what we've got. But they're just being asked to deal with bones, really, I think, to
And
be
sing
honest.
very loudly, yes.
Shall we talk about lyrics? We've spoken about music. We were disappointed by the range of the music and the fact that the range wasn't wide enough to carry the variety.
Yeah.
The lyrics, of course, are by Tim Rice. So Tim Rice,
Yes.
whose epic musical, as I said, this is claimed to be. Successful or not, the lyrics?
In places.
Yeah.
I thought that they were interesting idea. The concept of Run Along Joe, which we just mentioned, is the sort of non-transitional song for that character from Lorraine. There are some nice concepts in the titles. The Ain't Where I Want to Be Blues that you mentioned earlier,
Which is the standout song.
and 30 Year Man. So all of these things encapsulate a concept well, but there were also passages of slightly more cliched activity in them, I felt, as well. Which was a bit less good, but I did think it was probably the strongest element, actually.
I agree with that. I've found a couple on lines, and actually they back up that argument because there's one, it's just a throwaway line, which is from the song called I Love the Army, which is the one that Maggio sings sarcastically, because obviously the army are essentially punishing him and indeed ultimately murder him.
Yeah.
But he's got this song called I Love the Army, which is pretty much the last thing he does before he disappears off to be murdered.
Yeah.
And he's got this line which is, if this is all they can muster, they can give it back to Custer, meaning that this army is a bit rubbish. And the one thing that absolutely comes out of this play is that this army is rubbish. And there's also a nice little reversal, because in the brothel scene,
Yes.
the girls in the brothel sing, "You've got the money, we've got the ass. Between the two of us, we've got potential." But then when they go to the gay bar, that lyric is used again, but in reverse.
We've got the money, you got the ass.
Yeah, so it's, this time
Yeah.
the gay men have got the money, and it's the young soldiers who have got the ass. So,
Yes.
and that's quite clever. There's some parallels. I don't think they're sufficiently obvious for us to always notice them, I have to say.
No.
I didn't spot that cleverness until I came away and researched it afterwards, which means that the lyrics have been obscured somehow.
I did actually find that was an issue in the production that we had. There was a certain amount of...
Poor diction?
Poor diction, yeah. Even from... we praised him a lot, but the guy we saw as Maggio, there was a great deal of rapidity in the early parts of the show, which is always usually a sign of things moving along.
Yeah.
But a little bit too much in that case. We lost a certain amount of, the
Clarity.
The clarity of... And it was quite a distinctive argot that he was using, and of course you had to really tune into it, and we weren't really given a chance at the beginning.
Of course, the show itself is just shy of 3 hours.
Yes.
Um,
And amazingly, it wasn't directed by Trevor Nunn. It probably would have been 5 if he had...
But the point is, of course, that the characters might be asked to speak fast in order to get them through 10 minutes quicker.
Yes.
But we did lose some clarity in the process. Directorially, what did you think?
I thought the staging was pretty good. I thought there were a lot of good sections in it, and I thought the way that the actual attack on Pearl Harbor was done was done very tastefully and was done thoughtfully. Wasn't so convinced by the way that the ending was handled, but that was perhaps more of a book issue. I thought a lot of it looked great actually, and felt good in the movement and so on. And some of the staging was very interesting.
There's one bit of staging I thought was dreadful.
Oh, right.
There was they got this stage at the back
Oh,
sort of raised.
the beach, yes, the infamous beach.
Well, there was, because obviously that part of stage is being used for lots of different things. There's a bit earlier on where a soldier has a jolly good spit into the ground at the back. And about 20 minutes later, it's become the beach.
Yes.
And the Deborah Carr character, Karen Holmes, is first seen lying on it. And I think she's lying on someone's spittle. And that's all I thought for 10
Well,
minutes.
there's worse things than that have happened on stage, but but yes, it was a bit clunky. That it was just this sort of big sort of flap that went up and down like a big sort of ramp off a tank or something like that. I don't really know what it was supposed to resemble, but it didn't give you a sense of beach, did it?
It didn't. I mean, there was a lot of projection, which can be effective.
Yes.
Was it effective in this case?
I've seen projection used better, I think it would be fair to say. I mean, there were some very nice artistic sort of pastiches of the postcards, for example, of the time, and assorted. I'm trying to think what else they had there. Was there some newsreel type footage or some sort of photographic type of stuff?
Well, yes. Also, when they're on the beach for the sex scene at the end of
yes.
Act 1, it gives you seagulls and things.
Yeah, I don't know that it added up to a sort of complete vision, really, that was coherent. But I felt it was...
I tell you what I thought the projection didn't do. I don't think the projection actually helped it to escape from the set.
No.
The set looked nice, but it seemed to be set in, the auditorium had been given a sort of coral frontage.
Yep.
And it looked like it was being a post-explosion building they were in.
Yes.
Which was very much before the case, because obviously if it ends with the attack, the building they were in, presumably as soldiers and all the brothels, etc., were not attacked. So I don't quite know what it was. Was it trying to presage what was coming, but for what purpose?
I think there was a sense of just general decline and seediness, actually. I think from that, as in perhaps trying to capture the buildings and the feeling of it being a bit of an outpost. But yeah, so I think it sort of partly created a world, but perhaps not as well as it possibly could have done. At the very end, I think there was a slightly confused stage picture with the two women at the rail of the boat, and also this sort of Boys from 41 stuff with a lot of use of packing cases. And it was a bit messy at that point. Partly a book problem, I think, trying to present those two things at once.
There's one musical theme I think we have to touch upon. There was a kind of leitmotif which represented drama, and you spotted it fairly early on as having a resonance, and I'm being polite here, for another piece of music.
It's the major motif of the score, really, and yes, and I know that as If Only Cheap Could Fly from, I forget what it was, Ormond Cheap.
Yes, 1980s children's programme about puppets.
That's the trouble with, strongly diatonic scores that don't transpose a lot. Eventually you're going to roll over some of the same territory that someone else has already covered.
It's a greater effect, I think, because
yes.
There was much more emotional investment in whether Cheap could fly.
That's true, actually. I do remember finding that quite moving. But they don't use the opportunity to ask if only Pruitt could box. Or bugle, for that matter.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the reviews, and I'd like your thoughts on what these reviews say. Oh, by the way, here's just a sort of throwaway fact. There were actually 2 songs in the film version From Here to Eternity. One was called The Re-Enlistment Blues, and the other was called From Here to Eternity. And they were written by Robert Wells and Fred Karger. And do you know what Robert Wells is most famous for writing?
No.
The Christmas song. You know, chestnuts roasting on an
open fire, yes.
With Mel Torme.
Mel Torme, that's right.
Absolutely right. Right. Quentin Letts, who's a fairly acerbic reviewer for the Daily Mail, has described From Here to Eternity, the musical, as, "This one is a hoot, not necessarily by intention. It contains soupy tunes, glistening biceps, reality star Darius Campbell and his jawline, and generally more corn than even leading breakfast cereal brands." And when talking about the speed at which Karen Holmes is prepared to rip her clothes off on one suggestion of sleeping with the Milt character, Quentin Letts observes, "From Here to Eternity, more like from 0 to 60 in 3 seconds."
Yes.
He said it's clunky direction by numbers, but ultimately, From Here to Eternity is harmless nonsense. It might even become a camp classic, full stop, at a stretch, full stop.
Yeah, I don't think so.
However, he does give Ryan Sampson tremendously good reviews.
Good, a lot of good audition songs in it, I would have thought. Particularly for the gentleman.
Well, there's only gentlemen in it, more or less.
Yeah.
Paul Taylor from The Independent said, when this opened in October, it was quick that it was going to be called From Here to November.
Yes.
But he then predicts it should have it should last quite a bit longer than that. Well,
right.
It ultimately closed in March, so that's 5 months. He said it's strong on atmosphere, and then it says that Stuart Brayson had written a catchy score which moves deftly through swing, blues, jazz, and early rock and roll, and can still bring out good old show business brassiness when needed. Now, this is what I'm talking about. He talks about the variety, but there's no quality in the variety. That's the problem. And he also observes that on the romance, there's no sizzle in the wisecracks, he says.
Yeah, that's true. I think there was a certain... In fact, we haven't talked about like humour in the show.
Well, there's a reason for that.
In common with Miss Saigon and Les Mis, it doesn't have a great sense of humour about itself.
Ms.
Which is not typical of, say, something that Tim Rice would normally be involved in. Usually there's a certain amount of dour humour, even in things like Evita, and it's sour, but it's there. And this, I think, did lack that quite strongly.
Time Out says that Darius Campbell and Rebecca Thornhill, as the older couple, struggle to inject interest into poorly sketched characters, lumbering ballads and asinine love stories.
Wow. Harsh, but true.
Mark Shenton observes, by the way, I thought Mark Shenton was perhaps on weak ground here. He says it's being billed as Tim Rice's epic new musical. This is the first time in musical theatre history that the lyricist has been given top billing. I don't know what W.S. Gilbert's got to say about that, but I believe someone might have got there first.
Yes. No, that's true, actually. I'm trying to think. Bublil and Schoenberg as well might be another example.
Yeah. I mean, it is trading on Tim Rice's name, but I don't think
Yes.
it's the first time that's ever happened.
No.
And interestingly, Mark Shenton says, the massive company of 33 give it their all, and sometimes a bit too much. So I think he's accusing it a little bit of overacting in one or two cases.
Yes, I think perhaps there's a little bit of that. There's certainly a lot of shouting in lieu of motivation. And I think the cast, it wasn't necessarily clear whether the cast all got where they were going with the characters, which quite different to some other stuff one has seen.
And finally, the Standard, Henry Hitchings, said it's vigorous and generally slick, but at times feels trite.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure it was slick.
No.
On vigorous, it felt a bit lumbering to me.
I think anything that tries to provoke your sense of moral outrage over an enormous event in history is setting itself a very high standard for that kind of thing, and this didn't quite reach it.
So, essentially, we weren't that impressed by From Here to Eternity.
Although the old gay men of that scene all looked suspiciously young and attractive, because they all doubled up with the soldiers.
Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah, it's true. Overall, then, how would you describe From Here to Eternity?
Can't rate it very well, but lots of things in it that I might have liked if it had all been given a bit more work, I think. And
could it be reworked successfully?
with a different composer?
And that's essentially the big problem for both of us, I think, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right, well, thank you very much, Tim. we've spent what seems like an eternity talking about From Here to Eternity, and indeed From Here to Eternity has now gone to eternity because it has closed. And I
Stop with the puns already.
I don't think that it's likely to be revived, but who knows? There we are. Who does know?
I'd have thought there might be some appeal for amateur companies if they can get that many men together, which of course could be a bit of an issue for them.
Yes, that's true. Mark, you didn't need that many soldiers.
No, true.
That cast of 33 wasn't all needed.
No, that's true. You could get it a little bit.
There's still only the standard number of principals. It needs more women. That's its problem for an amateur group. Right, thank you very much, Tim. It's been a great pleasure talking about this show, which, we haven't been very positive, but I think we should say that we went to see it because we wanted to see it. We were just disappointed. But that's, we haven't tried to be negative. It's just been thrust upon us.
All right then, well that's goodbye from me.
And it was indeed. Thanks very much, Tim. This episode of Musical Talk, edited and produced by Thos Ribbits. Presented by Thos Ribbits and Tim Sayward. Copyright Musical Talk 2014. And why not pop along and visit our Facebook page, or our Twitter feeds, or any of the other social media available to you. Do it now! But the variance within... It's ice cream, man. But the variance...
Mine's an oyster, please.
I'll have a 99.